Good morning, everyone, and welcome to LL97 Compliance, navigating the prescriptive pathway. We're thrilled that you all have joined us here today to learn about the process and protocol for moving forward with the prescriptive pathway. We've got some great speakers here today with me who will be taking us through this process. Gina Broker, who is Chief Sustainability Officer for the New York City Department of Buildings, is with us, as well as William Kilbacher, as engineer from our team. So with that, let's go into the agenda for today's presentation. The first part of the presentation will cover the New York City Accelerator, an overview just on our services, and then go into the policy overview, followed by the prescriptive energy conservation measures. We will pause after the first 7 to take some questions and answers. Then we'll finish up with the following 8 through 13 measures, do a Q&A after that, and then close it out with some closing remarks. So with that, let's get into the learning objectives for today. By the end of this training, you should be able to understand the affordable housing compliance pathways for LL97, identify the prescriptive conservation measures required by LL97 Article 321, and describe inspection details and documentation requirements for prescriptive conservation measures. So all of this will be outlined in the presentation, and I know you all are eager to learn about it. So diving into just a real general overview, many of you are already working with the accelerator and know firsthand what we do and how we do it. But for those that don't, I'll provide this brief overview and also invite you, if you are a service provider, to consider joining our program. The program is a program out of the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. We are here to help buildings control costs, meet compliance requirements, lower energy savings, reduce carbon emissions across buildings across the city. We provide free technical guidance. We identify potential building upgrades that will help meet emission limits for these buildings. We offer no-cost building operator trainings and other trainings that support green workforce development. And we connect the decision makers with the service providers and financial incentives, financing, to help them get these projects done. So moving on, next slide. So who's eligible to participate with the accelerator? We work with all buildings greater than 5,000 square feet, new and existing. So if buildings come to us that are smaller than 5,000 square feet, we do refer them to our partner organizations. It's very easy to work with us. You can connect with us in a variety of different ways. You're connected with an account manager who really is your trusted guide through this process. And you'll receive, or the stakeholders will receive objective, advice that's customized to your building's needs. There's no cost or catch. You can engage with us as little or as much as you would like. So next slide, please. And just a bit about our service provider program. I mean, there's a lot we can tell you about all the different services we offer, but I'm going to dive into a little bit of an overview on the service provider program, because again, many of you are already service providers, but for those who are not, we'd love to talk to you and to bring you into our service provider network. Our service providers are here to, kind of serve as an extension of the accelerator to help educate and support building owners in this transformation. And obviously contribute to job creation, workforce development, and economic growth across the city. We do have a focus on recruiting minority and women-owned businesses, And we really want to, have the service providers provide a streamlined process to help decision makers implement projects in their buildings. Our service provider list includes a very large number of categories, as you'll see on the next slide. And we do focus also on recruiting service providers who focus on buildings that are smaller than 25,000 square feet. We vet our service providers, so there are a few hoops to jump through, not too big, but we want to make sure that the service providers that we include can participate with the, for example, with the existing utility programs and NYSERDA programs. Next slide. So this is just an overview of the categories. It's not totally inclusive, but as you can see, it's very expansive. And we are looking to continually grow our list. So with that, let's move on. This is just a quick look at the service provider lookup tool that is on the Accelerator website. We actually have a lot more service providers now enrolled in the program, which is great, and it's continuing to grow weekly with new service providers being onboarded on a regular basis. The service providers get a number of different resources and tools from us to help promote their affiliation and reach to buildings in the market. And next slide. So with that, we will move into the training, and I will turn it over to Gina to take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for organizing this and having us join you today. We're excited to see everybody here and talk about the training on 321. I think there's a couple different parts here. We're going to talk very quickly about the requirements of 97 and Article 321, and then I'll turn it back over to my friends at the Accelerator to talk through how you identify a STEAM system, what's required of the prescriptive conservation measures, and then what the reporting and the penalties are like and what resources are out there. So let's talk about Article 321. You may have questions at the outset of this to try and figure out, am I a 320 building or am I a 321 building? We have covered buildings lists that are found on our website. We'll make sure that you have the link. So I can see some things happening with our text. We'll make sure we get that fixed for everybody. The covered buildings lists that are on our website, however, I want to caution you, we don't have all of the information to know exactly where every single building in the city belongs. So we have gathered data from several other sources and other agencies, have put together the best list that we can. If you feel that you're on the wrong list, you can reach out to us at Department of Buildings. We're putting together some resources to help you out. But one thing to keep in mind is that the covered buildings lists are produced based on the property or the BBL, the building block and lot. So a lot might have multiple buildings on it, and those buildings may be subject to different compliance paths. So please keep in mind that it's based on the building's individual status. And so you should be planning based on how that each of those buildings are classified, not just a single property or the entire BBL. Now, if the building does qualify as a 321 building, that entire building is regulated as a 321 building. So if you have, for instance, a rent regulated building with a retail use on the lowest floor, that whole building is still treated as 321. And I do want to just raise that if a building's rent regulation status changes in the future, even if you go through this process of reporting for 321 at some time, if you fall out of rent regulation, that would make you subject to 320, and you would have to start reporting your annual emissions. So there are two compliance pathways. We're really focused on the prescriptive energy conservation measures today. But I want to make sure that everybody is aware that an owner can also report and comply by meeting the 2030 emissions limit. So If you're building and you've been tracking through your benchmarking and you're seeing that your emissions limits are falling below 2030, that might be a simpler and easier way for you to report. And we believe that about 20% of 321 buildings can report and comply that way. So make sure you pay attention, that you check that. And then the other way is through the prescriptive energy conservation measures, which we'll get into detail here today. So if we talk about the PECMs, we have published a filing guide. We have the link for that filing guide. And it is, in process of being updated with more information. It does describe how we are looking for documentation. 9 of the 13 PECMs require only an attestation, meaning that your retro commissioning agent is going to go on site. They're going to verify that these measures have been implemented, look at whatever documentation and records you have on site, and then they're just providing an attestation to the department that these things have indeed been completed at the building. But for 4 of the PECMs, we want more detail. We need that commissioning agent to gather the information, in some cases submit a schedule or some other documentation that demonstrates that they've been able to verify that all of these measures have been completed. So that's detailed in our 321 guide. There are sampling requirements and additional clarifications on each of the PECMs. So we encourage you to look through that guide. Let us know if you have questions. And then we are working on some reporting templates. So if you haven't completed the work and you haven't documented all of it and are still working on it, then you'll be able to use these templates to help you with your documentation. And those are coming out very soon. The next slide. So if you haven't seen this yet, we do have a description of what belongs under 321 pathway. This was developed with HPD, and they have lots of very detailed descriptions under each of these. So under 321, if you're a building that has more than 35% of your units in rent regulation, then you are subject to this 321 pathway and not reporting annual emissions. This captures HDFC co-ops, and then a number of programs that are described in the definition of covered buildings. If you're not sure if you meet the requirements of those definitions, we encourage you to work with an architect or engineer or an attorney that can help you figure out how your building is classified. In the case of 321, again, you're either reporting that you meet the 2030 limits or you're following these prescriptive energy conservation measures. There are some buildings that have rent regulated units, but they fall below that 35%. And so those buildings are subject to 320. However, they're on a different timeline. And so if you are rent regulated, but fall under the 35%, your deadline for reporting is in May of 2027. So you have 2 more years before you have to start collecting that emissions data. And then if you're an income restricted property, then your first reporting doesn't happen until May of 2036. So your first reporting year is 2035. It sounds like you have a lot of time, but we encourage you to reach out to the accelerator today. The reason is that in 2035, you'll be subject to 2035 limits, and that's going to be a big change. You need to be planning for it and working towards those more aggressive limits. So you can access this on our website or on HPD's. Lots of great information there. Let's talk about the deadlines, the reporting, and the penalties. So this is a one-time report. We've gotten that question quite a few times. If you really are a 321 building and you submit your report to us before May 1st, 2025 of next year, then you've met your obligations under Local Law 97 and you're done. But you need to be reporting that all of the PECMs were fully implemented by the end of this year. If you don't submit your report, there is a $10,000 fine, And if you submit your report, but you demonstrate that you didn't meet compliance, that's an additional 10,000. And I want to stress, this is per building, not per property. You have to be working with a qualified retro commissioning agent to submit and complete these reports. That's a registered design professional, certified refrigerating system operating engineer, or a licensed high pressure boiler operating engineer. RDPs, obviously, they're licensed by the state, but these other professionals are licensed through Department of Buildings, so they have to be authorized to be doing that kind of work. And they cannot be on the staff at the building. They can work for the company that the owner has. That's okay, as long as they're not responsible for operating the building. And then the next slide, please. Retro commissioning agent, if you're familiar with Local Law 87, you'll know these credentials. They're the same. We must see the individual has one of these credentials. It has to be in effect and valid for the whole time of the work at the building and at the time of reporting. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but they're in our rule. And I just want to make sure that everybody is familiar with our rule. And remind everybody, please make sure you've read the law carefully for Section 321, Article 321, and that you've read through our rules that were released last year. And then the next slide. So finally, let's talk about financial hardship. There are opportunities for penalty mitigation. We understand that these buildings have unique challenges, financial limitations. But there are some ways to get relief if you cannot meet this deadline and you cannot get everything done. If you have an unexpected event like a flood, some other kind of unforeseen event, natural disaster that prevents you from finishing the work, you can come to us for penalty mitigation and a different deadline for your property. Now, just keep in mind, this is really a contract with the department. So these penalty mitigation pathways, you need to talk to us and help us understand everything that has happened and show us documentation. You could be participating in an eligible energy conservation project. And that means you're working with one of the agencies here. You have to be able to verify that you are doing the work with them, that the work is starting, and that you're going to be able to make progress that in many cases will get you farther towards emissions reductions than what the prescriptive energy conservation measures would by themselves. And then there's just a mediated resolution. That's an opportunity to have additional time to finish the PECMs or to comply with the 2030 emissions limits. And you have to be able to show us that you're making progress. So you must be able to show us that you've submitted your benchmarking, and we can see that activity is happening, that you have service providers engaged, that you're implementing the measures, and that you are actually making progress towards compliance. And so with that, let's dive into the specific requirements.
Thanks, Gina. Just going to give me a second while I take control here. Might need someone to give up screen share so I can share my screen. Okay. So I have the pleasure of walking us through by far the most exciting portion of the presentation, which is going to be the actual prescriptive measures themselves. So there are 13 of them. They are listed on the screen now. We're going to go in detail on what each one entails. But as mentioned before, the 4 measures that you see with asterisks here are the ones that require more than just an attestation. So these are going to require a little bit additional documentation and paperwork in order to file for compliance. But with that, let's talk about steam first, because a couple of these measures are really appropriate for buildings that have steam heating systems, and just knowing if your building has a steam heating system is really important. So how do you check if you have a steam heating system? Very basically, there's a couple ways to make sure that you do have steam. By looking at the big thing in the basement, the boiler, there are a couple different types that produce steam. Typically, you might see a Scotch marine boiler, which is a big cylinder type shape. And we also have sectional boilers, which are more rectangular, both capable of producing steam. But another giveaway is that you might see a sight glass located there with a water level indicating how much of the boiler is filled up with water. That's a pretty dead giveaway that you have a steam system. On the distribution side, the terminal units in the apartments themselves can also give you an indication if there's steam in the building. There's a couple different species of steam systems, one pipe and two pipe. With one pipe steam systems, you have one pipe going into the radiator. The steam goes in there and comes back out as condensate. And with two pipe systems, just as it sounds, you have one pipe going into the radiator and a completely separate pipe coming out of the radiator. So you can tell that way. Just some visual aids here to help assist in identifying what a Scotch marine boiler looks like on the left and a sectional boiler on the right. But you might not have a boiler and you might still have steam. And one way to do that is through district steam. So Con Ed utility can produce steam off-site and send it to your building through a high pressure network. So it'll come into the building in the basement at high pressure. There'll usually be some equipment to step down the pressure before sending it to the building, but you will also see a metering station such as the one you see on the right here, which basically measures the volume of steam coming into the building. In the apartments themselves, there's a wide variety of different types of radiators and convectors and PTACs that might be appropriate for a steam system. Again, one pipe steam, you're going to see just that one pipe coming in and out. You might see a little silver conical shaped air vent as well. For two pipe systems, you're going to see two pipes, one going in, one coming out. You might also see a steam trap, which is a dead giveaway. It's that icon in the upper right here, that little piece of equipment that keeps the steam where it should be. But there are also different types of terminal units that can support steam, like PTACs, recessed radiators, convector cabinets, etc. So there are a wide variety of terminal units here, but a steam trap is a good indicator that you're operating steam. So just a note quickly on formatting. So the way that we're presenting these measures is we're going to give basically a statement of purpose for each measure, the philosophy behind why each measure is required. We're going to talk about what types of buildings each measure applies to. We're going to give you some fast facts about each measure, so just some relevant notes on implementing the measure at your building. We'll also give some best practices. So these are just general suggestions on implementation where they're relevant. They might not necessarily be required by the word of the law, but just things that we would generally recommend from an engineering and implementation perspective. We'll also detail whether there are any overlapping requirements with Local Law 87. So, if you have a building that's also subject to Local Law 87, there might very well be some overlap, and you might not want to do double work if you have already complied with some of these measures through your 87 reporting. And then lastly, we're also going to walk through the actual details of the testing, installation, documentation, and reporting requirements for each measure. So to get started, the first measure is to make sure that there are appropriate adjustments to temperature set points for both heating and hot water. Very generally, you want to make sure that the spaces that a heating system is serving are at the right temperature, but not too hot because you don't want to overheat. So there are requirements in the housing maintenance code about what space temperature ranges are appropriate, and you want to make sure that you are heating your spaces to within those ranges, but not too much. You also just want to make sure that you are implementing setbacks where appropriate to save energy, and that the sensors and controllers are all communicating properly and are calibrated accurately. So this measure is going to apply to all building types, regardless of what type of heating system you have, and it does overlap with a Local 87 requirement, which I'll get to right now. So the 87 requirement, Local 87 requirement, is specifically that HVAC temperature and humidity set points and setbacks are appropriate for the space and occupancy type. And specifically for Local Law 97 inspection requirements, the retro-commissioning agent has to examine the set points, make sure that they're all operating as expected and that they are compliant with housing maintenance code. There's a little graphic here to the right, which indicates basically you have to have a minimum inside temperature during daytime if it's cold out, and that temperature comes down a little bit during nighttime hours. In terms of the actual documentation requirements for this measure, you basically just need an attestation by the RCX agent. However, if the building has recently completed a local law 87 energy audit, that document can be submitted as proof of compliance as well. Measure number 2 is to repair heating system leaks. The idea here being that if you have a steam leak, a heating hot water leak, a domestic hot water leak, any types of leaks, you're basically, something's probably broken, you're using more energy than you need to, and that fixing and addressing those issues is going to be beneficial. So this is going to apply to many types of building systems, whether you're using steam, whether you're using hot water. It's not going to apply to forced air buildings that distribute conditioned air through ductwork, and it's also not going to apply to buildings that are heated through electric resistance. Oftentimes, this work can be completed in-house if you have building staff who are capable of maybe doing some light plumbing work or something like that, and it does also overlap with local law 87 requirements. The specific local law 87 requirements is pretty much a one-to-one match. It's that steam and system hot water leaks have been identified and repaired. Specifically for local law 97 inspection requirements, the RCX agent has to visually inspect the equipment, make sure that there are no leaks, and if leaks are found, they have to be repaired and documented. Again, the exception being for forced air and electric resistance systems, those are exempt. Documentation, very similar to the first measure. You have to have an attestation from an RCX agent, but a local law 87 energy audit from the last 4 years is also sufficient to meet the requirement. Measure number 3 is to maintain the heating system. This one is basically just to ensure that all of the equipment is in good operating condition. It's going to apply to steam, hot water, and electric systems. This is sort of just general best practice stuff. Keep things clean, keep things operating, keep things smooth and greased. It's going to apply to all building types. This is also very much an local law 87 requirement. A lot of buildings have a maintenance contract with a contractor that will come in on a regular basis and perform this service. So it very well might be something that hopefully most buildings are doing already. Specifically, 87 requires that boilers are tuned for optimal efficiency where applicable. And it also requires certain pre-functional testing to be done on major equipment to ensure that everything is in good operating condition. For 97 specifically, the RCX agent needs to confirm that all heating system components in the covered building are in good working order. Some examples of that are to check filters and vents, make sure that things are clean, make sure condensate drains are cleared, check that equipment sequences are being followed properly, etc. For documentation, the attestation from the RCX agent is sufficient here. And again, local law 87 energy audit report from the last 4 years, or documentation that was used for utility incentive or a rebate program may also be submitted as proof of compliance for this measure. Measure number 4 is to install individual temperature controls or insulated radiator enclosures on heating units. So the idea here is that it's very, very easy to overheat spaces. So you want to ensure that you are providing enough heat to keep residents comfortable and to meet housing code requirements, but you don't want to overheat too much because you're using more energy than needed. So controls on an individual level help to improve comfort for residents and reduce that overheating. And there are a couple of different examples of controls that can be installed here, depending on the heating system that the building has. So digital thermostats that you might see on a wall might be appropriate for a hot water heated hydronic building or an electrically heated building. For hot water and steam specifically, something like a TRV, a thermostatic radiator valve, or a smart wireless TRV might be appropriate. And for buildings that use a metro steam system, an insulated radiator enclosure, which is basically a housing that sits over the entire radiator, is also a means for compliance here. So you have to implement or ensure the past implementation of this measure for all building types. And because this is going to involve terminal units, a survey is required of apartments, which means that in-unit access is going to be required as part of the documentation and inspection process here. There isn't a one-to-one Local Law 87 measure related, so it's specific to the prescriptive path under Local Law 97. And as far as the required inspections, there's going to be a minimum 80% sampling rate required for the retro-commissioning agent to look at apartments individually and confirm that there are functioning thermostats or individual controls on heating units. Or if there are not functioning controls, each radiator or heater needs to be installed with the appropriate control in order to comply with this measure. Also important to note that if during testing or an interview with building staff or occupants, it's discovered that there are certain sections of building that are either over or underheated, that those sections be inspected to ensure that there are properly functioning controls or that controls are installed in those areas. This measure is one of the measures that requires more than just a simple attestation by the RCX agent. There is going to be a specific worksheet, the template of which will be provided to handle the filing requirements for this measure. And those are going to require additional proof of completed thermostatic radiator valve and orifice plate installation, or proof of enclosures installed, or a temperature control survey conducted by the RCX agent. Just a little bit more information here regarding TRVs. So specifically for 1 and 2 pipe steam systems, the TRV is a little device that you can install on the radiator itself to ensure that the unit is not overheating the space. And there is an exception here. So for 1 pipe systems that have proper venting, and we'll discuss venting in a little bit, and where there are wireless sensors that have been installed in at least 25% of the apartments that are providing feedback to the boiler controls, then this is not required. But for all others, individual system unit heaters controls are required. On the hydronic side, you do want to confirm that there are functioning local controls at each heater that are not overheating the space. And for any units that are found to be broken, they need to be repaired or replaced. Similar for electric resistance systems, you want to ensure that there is at least 1 thermostat to control the radiators in each unit, and that it's working properly. Measure number 5 revolves around insulating heating and hot water piping. So when you have exposed bare metal pipes that are filled with a hot fluid that's going to radiate heat, it's going to result in energy losses that your central system is going to need to make up. So it's best to cover those exposed pipes in insulation to mitigate against those losses and ensure that you're only using as much energy as you need to and not being wasteful. So this measure is going to apply to steam heating piping, heating hot water piping, and domestic hot water piping. It's not going to require that you open up any walls or assemblies or ceilings to access uninsulated pipes. And you also do not have to touch pipes that contain asbestos, but all other pipes, no matter the size, are going to need to be insulated. This is applicable to all building types. This work can often be completed in-house by building staff, so you might not have to go hire a contractor to do it if your staff is comfortable and confident doing it. And this, unlike Local Law 87, which requires just piping 3 inches and larger be insulated, this measure is going to be required for all piping, regardless of pipe diameter. Just sort of a general best practice and recommendation is to consider custom removable insulation jackets on larger system components that you might need to access for maintenance, it might make a lot more sense to get something custom that can be put on and off, so that you don't have to ruin your installation job every time you need to adjust something or fix something on the system. As I mentioned, the 87 component, there's a little bit of overlap here. The local 87 requires that water and steam pipes only 3 inches or greater in diameter be insulated. This measure goes a step further and requires that all pipes be insulated. In terms of the inspection requirement, the local law 97 RCX agent needs to sample all the piping throughout the building according to rates published in the filing guide, and verify that all accessible heating and hot water pipe is insulated according with Energy Conservation Code. And that also includes that if there is existing insulation that is degraded or broken or just in bad shape, that it needs to be replaced. Again, with the exception that if that existing insulation has asbestos, you don't need to touch it. Documentation requirements. This one is a measure that can be attested to by an RCX agent. You can also provide documentation that is used for a utility incentive or rebate program as proof of compliance. Measure number 6 is to insulate steam system condensate tank or water tank. So it basically here, if you have a large metal vessel filled with a hot fluid, it's going to try to radiate that heat out, very similar to how an uninsulated pipe might. And your central equipment is going to have to heat that back up if there's losses. So if you insulate your tank, you're going to prevent those losses and save energy. That's the general idea here. This is going to be applicable to buildings with steam and hot water systems, with the exception of vacuum tanks. So if you're running a steam system on a vacuum and you have a vacuum tank, you do not need to insulate the vacuum tank. You also do not need to insulate a tank that's part of a pumped return system, because if you are pumping a very hot fluid, which the insulation will hopefully keep your fluids hot, you might incur some pump damage. So it's not required in those situations either. This is a measure, again, that's unique to the prescriptive path. There's no 87 parallel. The inspection requirement's pretty straightforward. The RCX agent needs to confirm that any hot water tanks that need to be insulated are insulated. And again, vacuum systems are not required to be insulated. Vacuum tanks are not usually required to be insulated. And it's not required for pumped return systems as well. In terms of documentation, an attestation from the RCX agent is sufficient here. So measure number 7 is to install heating system sensors or boiler controls. So the central systems in a lot of buildings require sensors for feedback to determine whether they have sufficiently heated the building or not, so they can learn when to turn off and not overheat the spaces. And the philosophy here is that if you have a smart system that can tell what the temperature is outside as well as what the temperature is inside, then you're going to be minimizing your energy use and reducing energy waste. And it's going to be more comfortable for residents overall. So it's just generally a best practice. This is going to be applicable to all buildings, except it does not cover certain types of heating systems, namely central heat pump systems, unitized heating, where each apartment has its own equipment for heating, and there's no central system. This also doesn't cover radiant heating or electric resistance heating. So we definitely recommend trying to get all of the in-unit control work done at the same time, so you don't have to go back into apartments for the local controls, the sensors, the radiant barriers, all at different times. You can sort of knock those all out at the same time. And again, you will need in-unit access for some of this work. So just an example of what type of control system would meet the requirements here would be a functioning outdoor air temperature sensor, basically to tell how cold it is outside, and in-unit air temperature sensors in 25% of apartments. The idea here being that the boiler system should be able to tell when it's cold outside and it's cold inside, that the boiler needs to run and heat the space, and that when the indoor temperatures are satisfied, basically when it's warm enough inside, then the heating plant knows that it can turn off, even if it's still cold out, because it knows that it's done its job and that it can stop. Whereas if you just have a single outdoor temperature sensor that is modulating the boiler based on how cold it is, you very well might be overheating your spaces if the boiler can't get that indoor temperature feedback. Just some general best practices here. It's recommended to install that air temperature sensor in the outdoor environment out of direct sunlight so that it's getting a proper read on the air temperature and not being falsely heated up by direct sunlight. It's really important to calibrate indoor temperature sensors regularly so that they're giving good data back to the boiler. And installing a monitoring platform with remote access for building staff and ownership is definitely a great idea. Building operators love it because they don't have to necessarily be on site to know exactly what's going on. And it's always a good idea to label sensors appropriately for maintenance requirements. So 87 as a requirement states that HVAC sensors are calibrated and operating properly. This is going to go a little bit further than that. For 97, the requirement in terms of inspection is that indoor and outdoor temperature systems need to be inspected to confirm the presence of sensors. And if there are no sensors installed, then they need to be installed. Specifically for steam systems, wireless temperature sensors in at least 25% of dwelling units need to be installed to provide that indoor feedback to the central system. This is another measure that has special reporting requirements under DOB now. So there's going to be a specific worksheet and template to be provided that the RCX agent needs to confirm inspection, and then documentation such as a screenshot or output from the digital control system, proof of completion in a utility program that incentivizes this work, or documentation of the location of sensors is also going to be required to comply with this measure. We're going to take a break, sort of just work our way through about half of the measures. So just wanted to take a pause here and see if anyone had any questions so far.
Yeah, hi. Well, I'm going to jump in with some of the questions that are in the Q&A. And so one of them is, are radiant barriers required for hydronic and other configurations that are not typical cast iron radiators?
So we actually have a measure pertaining to radiant barriers in the next portion of the presentation, but radiant barriers are going to be required where there are the individual unit controls. So basically, if you have a convector cabinet, cast iron radiator, et cetera, that are subject to the controls outlined in, I think it was item number 4, then that's where barriers are required. But I'll also let DOB comment further.
Thanks, William. So if it's not possible to install a radiant barrier just because of physical limitations, then you're not expected to. Where a radiator of any kind actually gives you the space, and you can, do this kind of installation easily if you're already there, especially if you're doing other PECM modifications to a radiator in a dwelling unit, then you really should go ahead and take the opportunity to install the barrier so that it can help increase the efficiency of that particular radiator in the unit. So we've said that if you are not going into the units, you're not doing anything else to those radiators, you're not going to gain a lot from just installing a radiant barrier. So we've said, pay attention to this when you're already in the unit, when you're doing other PECMs, and if there's physical space for it to be installed, that's when it should be installed.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm going to throw a couple more questions out, and then we'll move on. There are a lot of questions. I'm not sure we'll get to them all, but we'll try to get them answered and out after the webinar. Next question is, can a building implement heating system sensors in apartments and avoid TRV valves on radiators if they have a hydronic system?
I'm gonna refer to the DOB on the specific
Yeah, I
reporting
think
requirements.
Yeah, we'll have to check on that one and see, and we'll get back to that person if the accelerator can send us their contact information.
Okay, we'll flag that. And then one more question I'll put in here and then we'll go on. I did LL87 last year with another company, but for LL97, I have another company which wants me to insulate other pipes that LL87 did not require. Is this correct?
Yeah, so the difference between 87 and 97 here is that 87 is going to put a diameter requirement on their insulation rules. So basically, piping that is 3 inches and larger needs to be insulated, whereas the prescriptive path requires that any pipe of any size that carries heating, hot water, steam, domestic hot water needs to be insulated.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to let us continue with the presentation. And again, we'll try to circle back on all the other questions that we haven't answered. We'll do it at the next interval or after the webinar. So William,
Great.
Proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, just jumping right back in. So prescriptive measure number 8 revolves around steam traps. So steam traps are an integral part of two-pipe steam systems, and making sure that they are functioning properly is the best way to make sure that your two-pipe system is operating efficiently. Essentially, a steam trap is a device throughout the distribution of the two-pipe steam system that keeps steam where it should be and keeps it out of where it shouldn't be. When you have steam where it shouldn't be in the return side of the steam system, you are using and producing more steam than you need to, and you are also opening yourselves up to risks of equipment damage. So it's just generally advisable to replace or repair broken steam traps when they need to be. This is going to primarily apply to buildings with two-pipe steam heating systems because those have by far the most steam traps. A lot of replacement work can often be done in-house by qualified or competent building staff. Other times, a heating contractor or a plumber is going to be the one who comes in to do this work. Steam traps are, they wear and tear and they break down. And a typical steam trap lifetime is going to be approximately 3 to 5 years, which is why it's really important as a general recommendation to inventory steam traps, know where all of the steam traps in the building are, have a protocol for testing and replacing any broken traps regularly. So staying on top of this, staying ahead of it. And it also might be worthwhile to consider orifice plates as an alternative in apartment radiators, if appropriate, so that you don't need to get into everyone's apartments all the time to do that testing and replacement. So there is a big parallel here with Local Law 87. So 87 does have a steam trap testing requirement. Buildings can sort of skirt that requirement or be exempt from it if they have recently replaced all of their traps already. But with regards to Local Law 97 inspection requirements, for two-pipe steam systems, there's generally going to be a temperature differential between your main supply and return. That temperature differential is indicative of a healthy system. If you have a low differential between your steam supply and your condensate return temperatures, that might indicate that you have systemic broken heat traps, which are going to require attention and replacement. So if it's found that there is a low temperature differential in your supply and return, then you're going to have to start testing steam traps at a sampling rate. And if a lot of those steam traps fail, so if more than 20% of those steam traps are failed, then all traps in the building are going to be needed to be tested and then either repaired or replaced if they're found to be broken. And you really need to create a full inventory of all of your traps, of all of your test results for documentation purposes. All of this work needs to be done by the end of this year, so it's very important to get on top of this. This is another measure that has a specific worksheet requirement for compliance under the DOB Now system. And it's going to either require proof that orifice plates or steam trap incentive documentation is provided, or it's going to require that steam trap survey. Just one special call out here for the testing protocols for high pressure steam systems. So high pressure systems are sort of their own beast. and that testing of high pressure traps is going to require specific use of an ultrasonic leak detection system instead of maybe a combination of ultrasonic and thermal testing. So it's specific to high pressure systems only. And again, any trap that's found to be not properly functioning needs to be repaired or replaced. Measure number 9 is to install or upgrade master venting on steam systems. So steam systems, when they're in between cycles, the distribution is going to fill with air. And when the boiler fires back up on its next cycle, the steam that it produces during the next cycle needs to work against that air and push it out of the system before the steam can get to all the radiators in the building. And the harder it is for that air to escape the system, the harder that steam has to push and the harder the boiler has to work to get that air out, which means that you're using more energy and fuel than you need to. So if you have a comprehensive master venting setup in your building, then it's very easy for that air to escape in between cycles, and your boiler does not have to work hard to fill the system back up with steam at the start of a cycle, which is why master venting is recommended and a requirement here. So this is going to be required for all one-pipe steam systems, as well as two-pipe steam systems that work at atmospheric pressure. So master venting is not going to be required for two-pipe systems that run on a vacuum. This work is primarily going to take place in the basements. That's where the biggest steam pipes are in the building that fill up with the most air that need the most venting. And it's really recommended to work with a trained vendor who's done this before, so that you can ensure that it's done properly. So Local Law 87 does have a parallel here. It does have some testing requirements to see if your building needs to install master venting. So you can basically set up some sensors to monitor temperature between the boilers and the ends of the steam mains to see how quickly steam travels from the boiler to the ends of the distribution. If your steam takes too long to reach the ends of mains, then you need to install master venting. So just see that you've done this work already under Local Law 87. You might have already done it. For Local Law 97, the required inspection is that master venting is installed at the ends of mains, at large horizontal pipe runs, at the tops of risers, and at vertical pipes branching off where it's appropriate. Again, make sure that you're working with someone who knows what they're doing in installing vents, and that testing pursuant to guidance issued by the department may be employed to identify loops that aren't functioning properly. So if it's a little bit more involved, and you need a little bit more help identifying where to install the vents, that guidance is going to be forthcoming. Again, you do not have to install vents on two-pipe systems that operate with a vacuum. This is the 4th measure that requires specific documentation under the DOB Now system, and you're going to need to, more than just an attestation from the R6 agent, you need to provide proof of a completed utility program that incentivizes this work, or provide schematic diagrams of steam loops with a schedule of vents and results. So the 10th measure is to upgrade common area lighting to comply with Energy Conservation Code. Pretty simple proposition here. If you turn lights down or off when they're not needed, it saves energy, and that lighting systems need to be upgraded to meet Energy Conservation Code. This is going to be applicable to basically any light in the building that's not in an apartment. So common area, back of house, lobby, hallways, exteriors, controls, etc. This applies to all buildings, and again, it does not apply to apartments themselves. There are lighting requirements under Local Law 87. They pertain mainly to light levels and that they are appropriate to the task and that sensors and controls are working properly. For Local Law 97, it's basically a little bit different of a story here. It's basically saying that if you have a lighting system installed after 2010, it must be compliant with the Energy Conservation Code that was in effect at the time of installation. And for systems that are older than 2010, they must be compliant with the 2010 Energy Code, or they must be replaced if they're not compliant. And compliance is confirmed through examination of installation records or visually by the RCX agent. In terms of what documentation is required here to show compliance, there is a report submitted under Article 310, Chapter 3 of Title 28 of the Admin Code. That is Local Law 88. That's the lighting and submetering law. And in order to comply with 88, in addition to this, you need to have this measure be certified by a licensed electrician or a registered design professional. Also note that documentation that was used for a utility incentive or a rebate program that incentivized this work may be able to demonstrate compliance as well. This is just a chart here that indicates which iteration of the Energy Conservation Code is in effect depending on when you installed your lighting. So, if you are upgrading your lighting from 2010, you need to have several different iterations of the code are available to you to comply with. But as you install later, you have to meet the most current code essentially. Measure number 11 is to weatherize and air seal where it's appropriate. So the philosophy here being that if you have a leaky envelope, a leaky building, and you have conditioned air that is escaping, or you have unconditioned air that is infiltrating into the space, that's going to put additional load on your heating and cooling equipment. And that if you can properly seal all of those locations of infiltration or loss, then you're going to allow for some energy savings. So this is applicable to all buildings. It's also an 87 requirement. So it's something you might have already looked at as part of those 87 works that you've done. Can often be completed in-house, but we recommend using robust materials that are strong and last a long time, so you're not repeatedly doing this work. The 87 requirement here says that in all accessible locations, sealants and weather stripping need to be installed and they need to be in good condition. Similarly, for 97, the RCX agent needs to perform an inspection and verify that components of the envelope, including windows, doors, other penetrations, are sealed and that the air barriers are in good shape, and that where there are major sources of leakage, then those seals need to be installed or repaired or replaced. For documentation, this is another one that needs attestation by an RCX agent. You can also submit a recent Local Law 87 energy audit report or documentation that was used for a utility incentive or a rebate program. Measure number 12 revolves around exhaust fan timers, excuse me. So for buildings that have mechanical exhaust and where those exhausts are designed to operate intermittently, then it's important to make sure that they are operating as designed and not operating constantly so that you do not use energy unnecessarily. So this measure revolves around ensuring that the timers and controls on fans are working properly. 87 is a little bit different in its requirements for exhaust. It's basically saying that 87 wants you to ensure that exhaust flow rates are appropriate for facility requirements. The 97 requirement here is that exhaust fans be inspected. If they're supposed to be operating intermittently, then you want to make sure that their timers and controls are turned on automatic and that they are sequencing as they should. For fans that are intended to work continuously, you just want to make sure that they are in good operating condition. The documentation requirements here are that an attestation is filed by the RCX agent. So the last item here, just touching back on radiant barriers, it is required that you install radiant barriers on appropriate radiators, convectors, cabinets, etc. Radiators, they radiate heat in all directions. They're typically placed up against a wall, and the space is on one side of the radiator. So if you have a radiator without a radiant barrier, it very well might be giving the wall a good amount of its heat. So a barrier is basically a a foil system that reflects heat back into the room to make sure that all of the heat, or as much of the heat as possible from the radiator, is actually heating the space that it's intended to, and not simply the wall next to the unit. For applicable buildings, this is, again, designed to be installed where TRVs or radiator covers are installed, so where you're already getting in to do the work for controls and potentially orifice plates, then this is required as part of that work. It's relatively simple in that it can usually be completed in-house by installing these barriers, and you do need in-unit access as part of this work as well, so that's something to keep in mind. There is no direct 87 measure here, so it's a unique component of the prescriptive path and those measures. In terms of the inspection, basically an RCX agent needs to confirm that the foil-faced barriers are installed in radiators where they're applicable, again, where the TRVs or radiator covers are installed. And it needs to be installed in places where the primary heating is provided by radiators and not some other form of heater like electric resistance, for example. There are some exceptions, so fin tube baseboards and convectors simply where it's not really possible to install this, or where what's called destructive work is required. Those are exceptions. Documentation for this is an attestation by the RCX agent. So that's it for the prescriptive measures. That was just a pretty high-level walkthrough of the philosophy behind each measure, the details about installation, details about reporting requirements, testing requirements, etc. So now we're going to open it up for some more Q&A.
Thanks, William. Okay, I will go back to questions here that are in the Q&A. And again, I think that some of these I can take or any of us can jump in on, but which TRV is recommended by the city? This question, I have a company doing LL97 work and they gave me some companies, but I'd want to know if what I purchase is recommended by the city. And I'm going to jump in and just basically say I don't think that the city doesn't recommend specific companies. I don't know if there are specific types of TRVs from a technical perspective, William, that you can address, or Gina, that you want to add in here.
Yeah, I don't know if we would necessarily point you to one brand or another. There's a couple big players in this space that we've seen commonly installed, things like a Danfoss valve or a Tunstall valve. There are also several different iterations of a TRV that can be equally effective depending on the exact layout of your heating systems and heaters. There's a two-piece system essentially that completely sits on the radiator valve. But you do need access to the radiator valve in order to change the TRV or adjust it. There's also a three-piece system where you sort of have the control attached by a capillary tube off to the side. So you have a lot more flexibility with those to locate the actual control outside or farther away from the actual heater itself to give you more installation flexibility. So it's really just going to come down to what works best for your setup. I would just generally recommend working with a contractor or engineering consultant who has experience, and they'll be able to guide you.
Okay. And to add to that, William, I hope owners will approach this not just as a compliance exercise. And for these particular buildings, you have this one-time compliance requirement, but maintaining your system is a long-term commitment. And so you want to make sure that you're working with your service provider, considering the quality of the options that you have and the durability and the long-term impact that they will have for a building. So it just, make sure that you're working with those service providers to pick something that is a good investment for your building. Certainly the city isn't familiar with your building. We haven't been in there. We don't know. That's why you have a retro commissioning agent working with you, and that's why they're required. So work with them to make a decision that is the right decision for your building that will help you save energy for the long term and not just for this one-time report.
Great, thank you. All right, next question. And Gina, you can probably take this one, is For houses of worship, how are they categorized, under which pathway?
Houses of worship are under 321 if that is the primary use of the building. So if we end up having a very large building with a very small house of worship, they may not qualify for Article 321. They may be subject to Article 320. So it really depends. Is that the primary use of the building? Is the dominant thing that is happening? And if that's the case, then that entire building will be subject to 321. But if it's not, you should be working with somebody for a plan under the 320 pathway where you're reporting emissions on an annual basis.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question, I think for you probably, Gina. The company that I hired to do LL97, how do I know if they're authorized to do the job by the city?
Great. So we go back to those requirements of who can be a retro commissioning agent. So we have a slide on that. You want to make sure that they are either that licensed professional with the state or they have one of those licenses with the city and that it's current. And then if they are not a registered design professional and they just have a license with the city, you also want to make sure that they have one of those retro commissioning credentials. So you should ask them to share with you the documentation that shows that they have the credential or they have the license, and they'll be asked to submit that with their report.
Okay, and also just as an added feature, if you do look up service providers on the Accelerator service provider lookup tool, we do list those designations. So you can filter by a variety of different certifications and descriptions for those providers. All right, Gina, one more question for you. When will filing templates or tools be available?
Well, we're working on templates for the 4P ECMs. And if you have already completed them and you have all of your documentation in another template, we've pointed to a number of programs where if you've gone through a program with Con Ed or NYCERTA and you have documentation from those programs, that will work. If you haven't done the work yet, and we'll hopefully be getting those templates out very soon, within the next few weeks, and you'll be able to use those for reporting. As far as the templates for everything else, it will be built into DOB now, and that won't be available for anyone to see until later this year. But if you're familiar with DOB now for Local Law 87, or for other things, so if you're familiar with the types of information that we collect in Local Law 87 reporting, those templates are available online. Even if you've never had to submit an 87 report, you can take a look at them and see what kind of information we're collecting. We're trying to make it more streamlined and simpler to document for Local Law 97. And those tools will not be available until we get them under development in DOB now, which is a lengthy process. And we're shooting to have that available by the end of this year. And certainly it is intended to be a simple process for you to fill out all of that information in DOB now. A lot of it hopefully can be auto-populated, and will save everybody time, on the end of the retro commissioning agents when they're filling it out, and on our end when we're reviewing it.
Great, thank you. All right, I'm going to take it back to William with this next question. How do requirements number 4 and 7 differ? Is there any overlap for the PCMs, number 4 and number 7?
Sorry, I've been speaking on mute. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can now.
Okay, sorry about that. I was just going to jump back to the list here. Okay. Installing, so item number 4 is installing individual temperature controls, and number 7 is revolves around system sensors. So individual temperature controls are going to basically inform the actual unit itself in the apartment to control the heat that's being released by that terminal unit in the apartment. Number 7 is basically about informing the central plant. So you want to basically have feedback to the boiler in the basement or the equipment in the central plant to tell the system centrally that the apartments are fine. You know, there's enough heat in the apartment so that the boilers can modulate down or they can turn off. So it's basically about holistically overheating the building versus making sure that the apartment itself is not overheated. That's really the difference between measures 4 and 7.
Okay, that's great. There's a couple more and that may dig in a little bit more. Number 4, does the 80% sampling requirement apply to all types of radiators?
So the sampling rate, 80% with regards to radiators, it's going to be applicable to the measure. So yeah, basically, if you're using a steam system, hot water system, electric resistance heating, then yes, we will need to sample at 80%.
Okay, and another one for number 4 is there a modification for radiator controls when there are no apartments, for example, a house of worship, common space?
I might have to defer to DOB on the specifics and if there are exceptions, but my understanding is that regardless of whether or not there are specific apartments or not, that 80% of the units need to be sampled.
Yeah, William, even if you're a house of worship, we want you to be making sure that the entire system is functioning. And so the sampling rate, I think, will be the same, but we will make sure we add more information about how each PUCM applies to a house of worship in our filing guide.
Okay, great. And one more on boiler controls. If any building control the boiler controller by sensing the return condensate temperature, should they need to install 25% in apartment sensor? Is that a question, I think maybe for William? Is 25%?
Yeah. I think my understanding of the question was that if the 25% of the system's temperature sensors are installed, does a system temperature sensor need to be installed? Is that the question?
I think so. It's not completely clear to me either, so we'll go with that.
Okay. Yeah, I think just generally speaking, the requirement is going to be that there are properly functioning indoor and outdoor temperature sensors here. So you want to make sure that the boiler knows, or the central system knows, what the temperature is outside, and that it knows what's happening temperature-wise inside. So it's definitely going to be both that are a requirement. And you want to make sure that those 25% of indoor temperature sensors are functioning and providing good data back to the boiler or the central plant so that it can modulate as necessary.
Okay, sounds good. And then kind of a follow-up, I think, on that is I have a heat timer platinum system with sensors in 25% of apartments. Do I also need to install thermostatic radiator valves on all radiators?
So yeah, again, that's a difference between measure number 7 and measure number 4. So if you do have a platinum heat timer panel in the basement, that it's probably connected to an outdoor temperature sensor, so you just want to make sure that that's working. You want to make sure that your 25% of apartment indoor temperature sensors are working, but that's just measure number 7. So separate to that, you're going to want to ensure that, if applicable, the individual temperature controls on each radiator, convector, whatever, are also installed and operating properly.
Okay, great. All right, next question. In regards to replacing or repairing all steam traps such that are all in working order, if a building passes a 30-degree test for a 2-pipe distribution system, what is the documentation required for the submission?
So I have a read on it, but I also will defer to Gina on the specifics. So there is an outlined process within Local Law 87 that documents how to properly take the temperature differential between the supply and return for a steam system. And so my instinct would be that to follow that process and documentation with heating sensors that are logging multiple boiler cycles at specific time intervals on multiple locations in the distribution system would be sufficient to demonstrate that there is a sufficient temperature differential between the supply and return. Does that make sense, Gina? Do you feel differently about that?
No, it does. And then, just to remind everybody, you wanting to pay attention to where you have overheating as well.
Okay, great. All right, let's move on to another question for measure number 8. Do we need to take any steps for steam traps in a one-pipe system, or is this measure applicable only to two-pipe systems?
Yeah, that's a good question. The temperature differential is going to apply to two-pipe systems because there isn't a return system in one-pipe systems. But for one-pipe systems, there are not typically a lot of steam traps. There might be some master steam traps, maybe in the basement or maybe somewhere else. And I think that the spirit of the rule would be that those all need to be tested and verified for proper function under measure 8.
Okay, great. All right, we have quite a lot of questions in here. Let me keep plugging through them. So for buildings that choose to do the PECM pathway are not able to complete all the work by the end of this year, can they apply for an extension? And I guess that would be for Gina.
So there is an extension clause in the rule. So as I suggested earlier, make sure just go back, read Local Law 97, Article 321. If you are not aware of it, the law has been amended since it first passed in 2019. So we always encourage everybody, look at Article 321 on DOB's website in the webpage for the building code. It's Chapter 3 of the administration provisions of the code. And that is the place where you will find the most up-to-date language. So please make sure that you have read Article 321. And then we have recently published Rule 103-17. The rules are posted on our website, so you can navigate to that rule by going to the 1 RCNY active rules on DOB's website. Make sure that you have read that entire rule. And in the rulemaking, we have a section on extensions. So if an owner knows that they are not going to be able to finish, if there's some reason, they need to work with their registered design professional or their service provider to apply for an extension and provide the reason why they were unable to finish. If you haven't started and in May 1st comes around next year and you still haven't started, that's not an extension. You have to be showing us that you have been making progress on this. File for an extension, and then you have an extension to submit your report by the end of August of next year. So make sure you're doing the work, that you're working towards compliance. But we know that things happen, and when it's necessary, you can submit for an extension at DOB. So those extension requests forms will be available early next year.
Great, thank you, Gina. All right, I think back to Will. Are occupancy sensors required in the sanctuary of a house of worship or only in the back of the house?
I might have to defer on that one. I think that the spirit of the law is really going to ensure that a representative sample of spaces are providing feedback for the central system. So if that's sort of the biggest, most important space in the building, I think really the intention is that it is driving feedback for the central system. But yeah, I don't know if there are specific carve-outs for houses of worship regarding that, but my feelings would be that it's applicable for installation of sensors.
All right, thanks. Gina, anything to add on that?
I think if they're asking about local law 88, we'll work to get some clarifications out on it.
Okay, thank you. All right, Gina, I think we'll stay with you. Can you recap the 4 measures that require DOB Now worksheets?
Wow, off the top of my head, I can't. It is outlined in our filing guide. So please go to the filing guide, read it, start to finish, and each of those 4 measures are highlighted within the guide.
Great.
Off the top of my head, I'm just looking at I'm cheating. I'm looking at the list right now.
4 and 7, 9.
4, 7, 8, 9. Yeah. Temperature
Okay.
controls on radiators and terminal units, system sensors, steam traps, and venting.
Thanks, William. But please read the guide, read the rule, and all those resources are there for you.
Okay, great. This I think may go to, well, I'm not sure, probably to Gina. This is I think it's an LL88 type question. If a building did previous incentive program for LED upgrades after 2010, would that count as being up to code at the time of the installation? Does that count as compliance?
Wow, that is why you should be working with someone to look at your particular building. If it complies with the code, it may be compliant with the lighting power density requirements of the code, and it depends on when you made those changes. So you should be referencing the code that was in effect at that time. It may not comply with the controls measurements that were required in the code at that time. And if you didn't update your controls when you updated your lighting, then you would be subject to the new control requirements under the current code. So you need to be working with somebody who really understands the control and lighting power density measures that are required in the New York City Energy Conservation Code.
Great, thank you. All right, next question, is rule number 10 the same as the requirement for LL88?
Mostly it is the same, and that's why we're going to just double check and make sure there aren't any clarifications that we need to make for house of worship. For local law 88, for those rent regulated buildings, it would be the same. And just to clarify for everyone, when you're applying local law 88 to a rent regulated building, those requirements do not apply to lighting in the dwelling units. It's only other spaces.
Okay, great. Yeah, it seems like we have a lot of lighting questions. Let me see I think we've got a lot of different ones. So one, again, regarding the filing requirement, will LL88 be a separate filing from LL97?
We're in the process of designing DOB Now, so all of the information will be in DOB Now. So if you have someone separately file a local law 88 report, then you would connect that to your filing for local law 97 for the PECMs. Or we may be able to create a path where you file local law 88 through your PECM report. At the time, we don't have that totally resolved, but it will be, both of them will be filed in DOB Now.
Okay, great. And this one's a more technical in terms, again, on PECM number 10, hallways and quarters that have normal light fixtures also serving as egress fixtures must have some sort of dimming or bylight controls In buildings that have separate bug eye fixtures, do the normal light fixtures have to comply? And then the latest lighting energy code states that lighting controls aren't required in areas of egress, and most hallways, stairs, and multifamily buildings tend to be in the path of egress.
I did not anticipate that we'd get into deep questions on local law 88. This is something that you need to research in the Energy Conservation Code. My understanding is that egress pathways still do have to have emergency lighting, or still have to have lighting controls, even if there's emergency lighting in those spaces. Off the top of my head, I don't have the code memorized, and you should send your question into either energy codes at buildings.nyc.gov or to the GHG emissions at buildings.nyc.gov, and work with a service provider who can, consult with you on the code.
Great, thank you. Okay, we will move on to a more general question. What exactly does an attestation by an RX agent mean, a retro commissioning agent mean?
It means that they're certifying that something has been completed, and that if you've read the rule, it also cautions you that you should have documentation and backup to prove that it happened. And you should keep that for at least 7 years. If we can see that a building says that they made all of these changes, that everything was implemented, and their emissions are not reflecting that in their benchmarking, it could raise red flags. So your service provider is attesting to the department that this thing happened. It means that they've seen some kind of evidence of it, and they're putting their license or their qualifications on the line, but it also has implications for the owner. So it means that we're not asking you to submit all of that backup documentation with your report, but we could ask for it later.
Okay, great. We have just a couple more minutes. And rather than try to pick out the last 1 or 2 questions from the list, I'm just going to ask both William and Gina to just leave us with any final thoughts or comments or things that are most important for all of us to think about as we move forward. So Gina, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Lisa. I just want to go back to the point that I made earlier. This is not about complying with the law. This is about reducing emissions. This is a more finite set of strategies for buildings that we know have a more difficult pathway, that may not be able to achieve the emissions reductions under 320. So they have this alternative approach. And that's what City Council said was appropriate for now. We want owners to be approaching this as a long-term energy efficiency project that does have associated carbon emission reductions that come with it. And if somebody does these things in a building, it will make a difference. So most of these are really geared towards regular maintenance, very easy energy efficiency measures to implement, but they do matter. And so I hope that owners are thinking about this as a way to invest in their building, to make it more durable, and continue to make it a viable part of the real estate and building sector in New York City. Don't make it an exercise to check the box.
Thank you, Gina. And William, any final thoughts or comments from you?
Yeah, I would definitely encourage everyone to reach out to the accelerator, use the resources that you have available. Really the raison d'etre of the accelerator is to help basically facilitate matchmaking and information sharing between building owners, operators, and the industry professionals that make this stuff happen. And really the intention here is not for this stuff to be onerous or a box checking exercise. It really is designed to improve the efficiency of the buildings, health and safety, comfort of residents, make your building more resilient, reduce energy consumption, of course. But you're not alone here, and you're not expected to figure everything out by yourselves. So there are plenty of resources available to you through the Accelerator, people who are more than happy to assist in answering questions, both basic and technical. And there are plenty of very experienced professionals who can work with you to make sure that these measures are installed properly, so that you don't have to do anything twice, which is never fun.
Great. Thank you both very, very much for participating in this really informative webinar. We will make the presentation available to all the attendees. Thank you all for attending, and we'll be in touch with you all soon, I hope. Take care, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.